The old farmhouse stood nestled amidst rolling hills. Fields stretched out like a patchwork quilt. The air was sweet with the scent of hay and wildflowers. This was home for Max and Mrs. Turner. Max, a golden retriever, had been Mrs. Turner's constant companion for as long as he could remember. Max loved their quiet life. They woke up early each morning. Mrs. Turner would make breakfast, and Max would sit patiently by her side. After breakfast, they'd tend to the chickens and collect fresh eggs. Max loved to chase butterflies in the warm summer breeze. Their days were filled with simple pleasures. Mrs. Turner would read on the porch swing, and Max would lie at her feet. He loved the feel of the sun on his fur and the sound of her voice. In the evenings, they would sit by the fireplace. Max would rest his head on Mrs. Turner's lap as she stroked his ears. Max was a good dog, always there for Mrs. Turner. He chased away loneliness and filled her days with joy. They shared a bond built on love, trust, and companionship. The farm was their sanctuary, a place where life moved at a gentle pace. And through the changing seasons, their love for each other only grew stronger. Time, like the changing seasons, marched on. Max, once a sprightly pup, was now an old dog. His muzzle had turned frosty white. His gait, once a joyous bound, had slowed to a gentle amble. But his heart, filled with love for Mrs. Turner, remained as youthful as ever. Mrs. Turner, too, had grown older. Her steps were smaller. Her hands, once strong and steady, now trembled slightly. But her eyes, when they looked at Max, still held the same warmth and affection. They adapted to each other's changing needs. Walks became shorter. Naps became more frequent. But their routine, a comforting constant, remained. They still woke up early, shared meals, and enjoyed the simple pleasures of farm life. Max noticed Mrs. Turner's increasing frailty. He would nudge her hand with his nose as if to comfort her. He would lie patiently by her side when she rested, his presence a silent reassurance. Their bond, forged over years of shared experiences, had only deepened with time. One crisp autumn day, a change settled over the farm. The air grew heavy with a sadness Max couldn't understand. Mrs. Turner, usually so full of life, seemed distant. Her voice, usually cheerful, was quiet. Max stayed by her side, his tail drooping. He nudged her hand with his nose, hoping to elicit a smile. But Mrs. Turner just patted his head weakly. Her touch, usually firm and reassuring, felt different. Days turned into nights, and the heavy feeling remained. Strangers came and went from the farmhouse, their voices hushed and somber. Max watched them, his ears perked, his brow furrowed in confusion. He felt a growing unease he couldn't explain. One morning, Max woke up to find Mrs. Turner's side of the bed empty. He padded through the house, his nails clicking on the wooden floor. He searched everywhere, his heart pounding with a growing sense of dread. But Mrs. Turner was nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks, and still, Mrs. Turner didn't return. Max refused to believe she was gone. He would sit by the front door, his ears perked, waiting for the familiar sound of her car. He would wander the fields, his nose to the ground, searching for her scent. A kind family moved into the farmhouse. They were good to Max, feeding him, petting him, and trying to make him feel loved. But nothing could fill the void left by Mrs. Turner. She was his person, his purpose, and without her, he felt lost. Max lost interest in his favorite activities. He no longer chased butterflies in the fields. He didn't wag his tail when the new family called his name. He would often stare out the window, his eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sadness. The once vibrant dog seemed to have aged overnight. His walks became slower. His naps became longer. His whimpers, once filled with playful excitement, were now low and mournful. He was a shadow of his former self, his spirit dimmed by grief. Winter arrived, blanketing the farm in a pristine layer of snow. The trees stood bare, their branches reaching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Max, his fur now heavily flecked with white, felt the cold seeping into his bones. He spent most of his days curled up by the fireplace, his eyes closed, dreaming of warmer times. He dreamt of chasing butterflies with Mrs. Turner, of feeling the sun on his fur as she stroked his ears. The new family tried their best to cheer him up. They brought him new toys, took him for walks in the snow, and showered him with love and affection. But nothing could penetrate the wall of grief that surrounded him. He was lost in a sea of sadness, his heart aching for Mrs. Turner. One particularly cold night, a blizzard swept through the farm. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and piling the snow high against the walls. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Max lay by the fireplace, his breathing shallow. His eyes, once bright and full of life, were now cloudy with age and sorrow. He could feel his strength fading, his body growing heavy. As the blizzard raged outside, Max closed his eyes and drifted into a peaceful sleep. He dreamt of Mrs. Turner. He saw her smiling face, felt the warmth of her touch, and heard her gentle voice calling his name. In his dream, they were back on the farm. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and Max, young and full of life, was chasing butterflies in the fields. He ran towards Mrs. Turner, his tail wagging furiously. She knelt down and wrapped her arms around him. Max took one last breath, a soft sigh escaping his lips. And then he was gone. His pain was over. He was reunited with his beloved Mrs. Turner, their bond unbroken by time or death. The blizzard subsided, leaving behind a world blanketed in white. The farm was quiet, the only sound the gentle crackle of the fire. But in the hearts of those who knew him, Max's legacy of love and loyalty lived on. He was a reminder that even in the face of loss, the power of companionship can bring light to the darkest of times.